Mr. Tom O'Reilly as your presenter. Tom is the Director of Prosperity Education, a publisher of digital and print educational materials, and the founder of ORP Cambridge, an established supplier of comprehensive project management and editorial services to educational publishers, schools, and authors. Tom is a qualified Agile project management practitioner with rounded academic and educational publishing experience. He has worked for the Tribune Media Group, Cambridge University Press and Cambridge-Hitachi, and as an independent contractor for clients including Pearson, Hodder, Cambridge International Examinations, Cambridge Assessment and Cambridge University Press.
Hello everyone. Thank you again for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. I thought I should start by letting you know the content of this talk. It's in 3 parts. I'm going to begin with an overview of prosperity education, in which I'll go through quickly our publishing portfolio. I'll then turn to our exam practice material publishing, specifically our Cambridge English portfolio. So this is the focus very much of this talk. And we'll be covering the 4 parts of the Cambridge English exam: reading and use of English, listening, speaking, and of course, writing. I'll then hand you over to our tutorial today. As Roxana said, this is being delivered by Margaret Cooze. The title of the tutorial is How to Utilize the Cambridge Mark Scheme in the Classroom. So I'll begin with a brief overview of prosperity education. Again, my name is Tom O'Reilly. I'm the Director of Prosperity Education. I'm originally from Cork in Ireland, but I've lived and worked in Cambridge for the last 20 years, and I'm very happy here. So in 2015, you may know that Cambridge Assessment changed their exam specification fundamentally. At the time, I was working at Cambridge University Press, and I realized that this was an opportunity for new publishing, for a new publisher to produce resources that suit the new exam format by Cambridge English. So I left CUP, and with a former colleague from CUP, we set up Prosperity Education in 2016. And since then, having started with Cambridge English materials, specifically exam practice materials, we've diversified our publishing. So today, our portfolio comprises teaching resources, student books, both student-facing and classroom textbooks, and of course, exam practice. And within the exam practice list, we produce materials for the IELTS exams, Michigan English Assessment, and of course, Cambridge English. You can view our catalogue on our website if you wish. And here are some thumbnails showing the book covers that we currently have available. I'll begin by explaining how our exam practice materials are produced, because this is important. When we started, we knew that we were publishing in an open area. We had looked at the competition, and we realized that if we're going to make a success of this, our content needs to be very high quality. So for all our exam practice materials, we follow the same production process. I'll quickly go through this process now. Obviously, it begins with an idea. And for the idea of a publication, we have dialogue with teachers and students. So we are informed very much by students and teachers as to what resources they feel are required. Once we've decided on an idea for publication, we look at the design implications. We want these materials to be, to resemble as closely as possible the actual exam format. And following this design stage, we find a suitable author. And again, this is important to our production workflow. We need to have a very experienced authors, and to attract these authors, we offer very good royalty terms. So the authors who work with us receive an exceptionally good royalty, and this gets their buy-in from the very beginning, and it leads to a very enjoyable production process and a relationship that continues after publication. So a lot of our authors will come back to us, and we will produce more books with them. Once we have contracted an author, we have an idea for the resource, the project enters development, And this is a lot of back and forth between the author and the development editor to make sure that the content the author is writing is suitable. And this, again, is important because later on in the production process, the content that is written by the author will go out for an external review. And our external review is carried out by Cambridge examiners, and it's a two-way process. So the author's content is reviewed by an examiner. The comments return to the author. The author makes the necessary changes, and these changes go back to the reviewer and again back to the author before the typesetting can begin and the proofreading of the near final content can commence. And the proofreading is again done externally with feedback going back to the author and to us, the publisher. And from there, we can arrive at publication. And this whole process typically takes, it depends on the exam itself, but it typically takes 6 months to get from idea to publication. So as I said, we began with publishing for the Cambridge English exams. And so we have a lot of Cambridge English materials, and we continue to produce Cambridge materials because the demand is such that we need to. We hear constantly from teachers and students alike that they really need new, relevant exam practice materials, and ideally with texts that are interesting and up to date. So I'm going to begin by going through the different parts of the Cambridge exam, using our resources to do that. And this screen is showing you content from one of our recent resources. It's at the C1 level, but again, we publish all of this content from B1 through to C2. So I hope you can see my screen. I'll zoom in quickly. As you can see, the use of English part 1 is multiple choice, and part 2 is what we call gap fill. I'm sure you're very familiar with this. Part 3 is a word formation, where students, as you know, are given a root word to transform. And part 4 is a keyword transformation. And this, interestingly, is an area that we know that students require extra practice in. So we have, in fact, produced several resources that focus specifically on part 4 of the use of English paper, a keyword transformation. So each book of practice tests comes with an answer sheet for students to write into. And again, this replicates the examination format, as you can see here. And detailed answer keys are provided in each resource. And in the part 4 answer key for keyword transformation, we try our best to break down the answers into the lexical and grammatical divisions. So moving on to reading, again, I'm taking an example from another C1 title. And reading at C1, as you may know, comprises 4 parts, whereas at B2 and C2, it's just 3. And the reading content is part of the use of English and reading paper. So this is part 5, continuing from part 4, use of English. Again, I hope you can see my screen okay, but this represents the exam format. So on the left-hand side, you have the text with the multiple choice questions on the right. Moving on to part 6, and furthermore, part 7. And finally, again, at C1, there's a part 8. Again, in each exam practice book, there is an answer sheet. And in the reading books, we have quite detailed answer keys. Again, this is something that came from feedback from students and teachers. The answers are given, the keywords and the questions are highlighted, but also clues from the text where these answers are actually found. And again, our feedback has been that this is a very useful aspect of these books, so we continue to do this. And moving on to listening, we published several listening resources in 2022, and these have become extremely popular amongst students. Again, they replicate the exam format, and I'll quickly go through the 4 parts of a typical listening test. The audio for this content was produced professionally, of course, and we decided to invest quite heavily in having multiple actor voices. We found that a lot of other resources on the market in listening comprise just a couple of actors trying different accents, and after a while it's very easy to tell that there were just a couple of actors. So
Part 2.
I'm playing
You hear a business owner called Amanda Thorpe talking about working with family. For questions 7 to 14, complete the...
And moving on to part 3 in listening. As you can see, it's multiple choice, and you have to turn your heads slightly to read the part 4 questions. And in our listening books, each book or each test has a complete audio transcript, which again is deemed useful, and again, finally, an answer key. And moving on to speaking, again, we have several speaking resources at each level. It's interesting because simply producing a book of speaking tests might seem quite simple, and we have here reproduced the format as closely as possible. And you can see going through the parts, here is the colored booklet for part 2. But I want to bring your attention to the back matter of our speaking books. Again, there is a mark sheet breaking down the marks that are available for this exam, but we also provide in each of these books a set of model answers. So one of the 10 tests in each book comes with a section of model answers, how the questions could be answered by the students, by the candidates. And here is an example of that model answer test. But what we believe adds further value is that in addition to the model answers, examiner comments are given on those answers. So each test is broken down in terms of how the students or how the candidates answered and what was valuable within those answers. Finally, moving on to the writing papers. Now, we published our first writing materials just this year. Again, with speaking, producing a book of writing test practice might not be hugely valuable for the readers. So we thought how best to produce this book. And we came to the decision that the book should be centered on the marking scheme available at the writing level. I'll bring you through a few pages from the C1, again, book in the Cambridge Writing Masterclass series. And you'll see that the units, each unit focuses on a different task type. The introduction explains each of the task types, explains, it gives information about the exam format itself. It describes how to use this book, but I shall show you how it works in a moment. And some advice and checklists for preparing for the exam itself, followed by a checklist that students can use when they're going through each unit, and indeed, ultimately in the test itself. On the right of this screen, you'll see the assessment criteria, the Cambridge assessment criteria broken down. This, as you know, is content, communicative achievement, organization, and language. And these assessment criteria will recur throughout the book in each unit. At the beginning of each book is also a planning guide that students can return to when they are trialing or writing questions. So here is one unit. Again, it's focusing on one of the task types. In this case, it's the essay. Each unit begins with some reminder points and points to think about before presenting an exam-style question. I'll just try and zoom in on the question itself. And what follows this introductory page are two different student responses, a student response A and a student response B. So student response A is an example of a high mark answer. It comes with annotations that are color-coded according to the Cambridge mark scheme. At the bottom right of this screen, you'll see an examiner summary. This continues to student response B, which is a response that merits a lower mark. And again, the format is the same. There are annotations pointing to specific things in the answer according to a breakdown of the Cambridge mark scheme. So when students have read these two responses, they are then presented with the same question again and have the opportunity to write their own response. Each of these writing books comes with end matter that comprises further practice tests. So each book has 4 complete practice tests, which students can work on once they've worked through each of the units. And I'll quickly run through the pages showing how these exam papers look. So it's part 1 and part 2. So I realize there have been several messages. I do hope that everyone can hear me okay. I think you can. I'll now move on and hand you over to Margaret Cooze, who is the author of these Cambridge writing materials. As Roxana said, Margaret Cooze formerly worked at Cambridge Assessment. I've known her for many years. I worked with her when I worked at Cambridge University Press. She was the principal examiner at Cambridge Assessment, focused on the writing papers. So she is in fact set the writing papers, so to speak. Unfortunately, Margaret can't be with us live today. So her tutorial is pre-recorded. So I shall play it now. And if you have any questions, do please put them in the chat. And hopefully we'll have time at the end to go through these questions.
As Tom mentioned, my name is Margaret Cooze. I have a background as an ESOL teacher and teacher trainer with the usual teaching qualifications. I also have an interest in applied linguistics and in particular on the teaching and assessment of writing. I moved on from teaching to work for Cambridge Assessment, firstly in Cambridge English, where I managed the production and the marking of a number of writing papers, particularly First Certificate as it was known then, B2 First, and IELTS. I then moved to work for Cambridge International, where I used my assessment knowledge in a wider context. Quite a few years ago now, I went freelance, and one of the first things I did was working with Tom on a book for CUP in the Approaches to Learning and Teaching series for English as a Second Language. From there, I worked further with Tom on a couple of volumes of exam preparation material, and I've been lucky enough to do a few more since then. Now I do a number of things. I'm an item writer, I produce exam material, I'm a principal examiner, a trainer, and much, much more. So the aim today is to discuss the Cambridge Mark Scheme and provide some insight into how it's applied with practical examples that you can use in your classroom with your students. And to do this, I'm going to refer to the contents of the C1 Writing Cambridge Masterclass, but everything that I talk about today will be applicable to other levels as well. The assessment criteria for the Cambridge tests are published on the Cambridge English website, as the criteria for any good high-stakes test should be, but they're often misunderstood or else just not referred to. You can see from here there are 4 different assessment criteria. They're equally weighted with 5 marks each. None of them is more important than another. You can find full details in the Masterclass writing book. There's no reason not to make use of these with students in the classroom, and I found it really insightful to see how students react to them. It really helps them to analyse their own work and to take ownership of their own learning. All of the Cambridge tests, of course, are linked to the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference, and we'll see how they link to that as we look at the different assessment criteria. It's important to understand this because the descriptors in the mark scheme are the same across all the levels. So, of course, they need to be interpreted according to the CEF level that's being assessed. The 4 levels we focus on in the Cambridge Masterclass writing books are these, from B1 up to C2. Of course, Cambridge does offer a test for A2, the key English test, but we're starting from B1. At B1 and B2, you'll notice there are 2 versions of the test. There's the standard version and then a for schools version. This is because a lot of students who take the tests at these levels are younger, and so the content and topics are tailored for this younger audience. Students taking C1 and C2 are usually slightly older, so there aren't for schools versions of these. But whether you're teaching for the for schools version or the main version, the same principles apply and the same mark scheme is used. And the books in the Cambridge Masterclass series relate to each of these levels. If you want to know more about the CEFR and to see what research has been carried out, the Council of Europe has a very informative website which might be interesting for you. You can see the link at the bottom of this slide here. There's a lot of really interesting material and links to other sites as well. The relevant part I want to highlight before we start looking at the mark scheme is the can-do statements. For each of the CEFR levels, there's a set of can-do statements which relate to each skill and indeed sub-skill. They're detailed on the website, but I wanted to pull out a few of the headline statements for each level, as these help us to understand how the mark scheme is applied at the different levels. We'll start by looking at B1. So these are the statements for the B1 writing. And I've highlighted here the words that I think are important, help to show what B1 writing is about. The idea that the student can write in simple, connected text. Topics are going to be familiar, and they're going to be asked to describe experiences and their own impressions of things. As we move on to B2, we can see that we expect a bit more. We're expecting clear, detailed writing here, and maybe a wider range of subjects. Students are expected to be able to give their point of view and to support it with their language. Also to pull out areas of personal significance, so they may be able to highlight and stress these points. At C1, we're moving up a bit more, and here we're really thinking about clear and well-structured text, also highlighting at some length. So obviously, as we go up the levels, students are asked to write longer and longer pieces of writing. They're writing about more complex subjects, which they can deal with because they have more language control. And of course, they're writing in a style that's appropriate to the reader. Now at C2, we're getting to a very high level of fluency and accuracy here. Students are expected to be able to write smoothly flowing text in an appropriate style. They're writing complex tasks with an effective logical structure. Interesting that summaries are highlighted here. I think summaries are a really difficult task to do. They're challenging even in your first language, let alone your second. So that brings us on to the 4 assessment criteria. So content, communicative achievement, organisation and language. Now there is some overlap between these, and examiners quite often will sit and debate whether a particular feature in a piece of writing is, for example, organisation with the use of a relative clause, or language. But of course each one is weighted equally. They're all just as important as each other. So we're going to start looking at each one individually. So first of all, content. So this might seem obvious, but it's one that students sometimes overlook in their rush to start writing, particularly in exam conditions when they're under stress. In the books, I mentioned that planning is an important part of writing, but many students either don't plan or rush planning. I think it's really key to writing a good response in the exam. So let's think, what is content? Basically, with just this question, is the response relevant to the task set? However perfect a piece of writing a student produces, it has to be relevant to the task. So this is about deciding what to include and, just as importantly, what not to include. Quite often students who don't do as well on content have gone slightly off topic and include information which isn't really key to the task. Of course, for all 4 levels, there's a limited number of words students have to write in, so if they go off topic, they might not have the time and the number of words to include everything that is required in the task. The other important thing they need to think about at this point is who the target reader is. This links in with the next criteria, but identifying who they're reading for is really important, and that comes under this area of content, that they're writing appropriately for that reader. An important thing to mention before we move on is that sometimes students have too many ideas in their task. They need to remember that they're not being marked on how inventive they are. They need to have content which is relevant to the task, but it doesn't really matter too much if their content is actually interesting or particularly expressive. It just needs to be relevant to the task. Let's have a look now at an example of a task from the C1 book. And this is the review. And I'll give you a few moments just to read through that. So to reach the higher bands on the mark scheme, we would expect students to be able to identify all of the relevant content for the task. These are the areas which I identified here. So firstly, why the student didn't like the character they're writing about, how it had an impact on their enjoyment in the show, and overall whether they would still recommend the show. So these three circled areas, students need to identify them in a task and know that to get the highest marks they have to include all three. So let's have a look at the descriptors for content now. For each of the different assessment areas, there are descriptors which show for a mark band of 5, 3 and 1 what is expected. So we can see here for full marks 5, all content is relevant to the task and the target reader is fully informed. The person reading the review would have all of those pieces of information. For 3, there could be something missing or some of the content may be irrelevant. Target reader is on the whole informed. For a mark of 1, the student might have misinterpreted the task or there may be a lot of irrelevant material. Therefore, the person reading the review wouldn't really have the information they were expecting. Now you'll see here there are only descriptors for the odd numbers 5, 3 and 1. That doesn't mean that students can't get a mark of 4 or 2. They're just as likely to be awarded as these marks here. Examiners are trained to look at the descriptors and to consider the content of each one, and they read down, so they start at 5 and think, has this student included all the content and is the target reader fully informed? If they are, they stop there and award that mark. If they're not, they read further down. So they would then look at the descriptor for 3, minor irrelevancies and omissions, on the whole informed. Now, if the essay fits in that category, they would award that. Quite often, they would be reading that and thinking, it's a bit stronger than that, but not quite as strong as a 5, in which case a 4 is awarded. And exactly the same process with a mark of 2. It's the midway point between 3 and 1. So how could we use this with our students? How can we make them aware of the content requirements? This is a task that I used to do at different levels with students, usually quite near the start of a course, because I feel it really gives them confidence. It's a slight variation on the think, pair, share activity that we often use in classrooms, because I've added on an extra think at the end to end it. I would give students a writing task or a past paper to choose a task from and ask them to look at the question and to identify the content individually, just working alone. So there's our think. In a pair, I would ask them to check if they've identified the same things. This also gives them good speaking practice, which is also a useful thing, even though we're focusing on writing. I then put them in groups to collectively write sentences to address these content points. It may just be 1 sentence for each content point, it might be 2, but it's quite minimal. Then for homework, I ask each student to complete the review, thinking about their target reader and embedding their sentences into their essay. This is a nice light way into writing. Students often don't like writing in a second language. They're much more fond of the other skills. But in actual fact, because they've done so much preparation in class, they've identified the content, they've got a good start with these sentences which they embed. This actually isn't too much work, whatever the level. The final thing, I would the next day or when the homework is finished, ask students to compare their final review with members who've worked in a different group, so that they're seeing different embedded sentences and they get a lot of exposure to different ways of approaching the task. It's a really nice activity at the start of a course. It provides a lot of speaking practice, as well as getting students really focused on the first thing they should look at when they get a task: what needs to go in, who's my target reader. Okay, so let's move on to the next assessment criteria. So, communicative achievement. This means, does the task communicate with the reader well? Now, as part of the content identification, we've asked students to identify who is the target reader. It's important that they do this so that they can communicate appropriately. This links with register and format. Genre and format are given in the task, and students mustn't change this. You can make sure that they distinguish between the task types quite easily. For example, checking which tasks might use headings and subheadings. There seems to be a tendency for some weaker students to turn almost every task into a letter. I'm not really sure why this happens. Maybe it's a safety blanket. They know what a letter looks like and they revert to this. But getting the right format and genre is part of communicative achievement. Register is vital for ensuring that the writing matches the target reader and, of course, the situation. Students will never have to write very formal English, but they should be able to identify the scenario and choose appropriate language to fit it. For example, language that they would use towards a friend will be different from language they would use towards a teacher or even somebody they've never met, someone they don't know well. Function is important, and this really links to the content. The content will lead students into which functional language they need to use to communicate well with the target reader. We'll have a look at a task now. So we've got a proposal here. This is another one of the C1 task types, and this is the example from the Masterclass book. We can see that the content is clearly identified. So this is about plans to hold a large sporting event in the region. So the student has identified they have to say why the sporting event should come to the town, how it would benefit the local people, and also what concerns local people may have. So we've identified the content. Adding to that, thinking about writing a proposal, we're thinking about the audience and how we get a proposal over to them. So we expect the suggestion should be clearly made. They're talking about a good location, making sure it's a good location, and we're talking to the town council. So the register here is going to be quite formal. The language has got to be persuasive, and that's indicated partly by the content, but partly by the format of a proposal. A proposal is looking to sell an idea to somebody. So for good mark, this student needs to use the content in a relevant way to communicate with their expected audience. Let's now have a look at the descriptors for communicative achievement. There's quite a lot highlighted here. We can have a look at 5. Uses the conventions of the communicative task effectively. And I think the most important, to hold the target reader's attention and communicate straightforward and complex ideas as appropriate. Moving down to 3, uses the convention of the communicative task. There may be some omissions, some differences, it's not as effective, but it still holds the target reader's attention, maybe only communicating straightforward ideas. For one, our student getting 1 is only using those conventions in a generally appropriate way. And the difference here is they may not be holding the target reader's attention. Now, this could be because they've used an incorrect register, and the target reader would be thinking, hang on, why is this person writing me this proposal in such informal language? It's not quite right. They would be distracted by that. Or it could be because there's a lot of irrelevant information that has gone off task and is confusing for the target reader. Let's have a look at 2 examples. These are the opening paragraphs from that proposal task. 2 different students have tried to communicate effectively with their target reader. I'll give you a minute just to read those through quickly. It's just the introduction. Remember, we're thinking about the conventions of a proposal here, whether the introduction holds the reader's attention. Hopefully that's enough time for you to have read. You'll find these 2 proposals, the answers, in the C1 book in full. The 2 students carried on fairly consistently. Hopefully you identified one which was stronger than the other. These were the marks that they were awarded for communicative achievement. The first one meets the criteria pretty well, uses the conventions of the communicative task effectively to hold the target reader's attention most of the time, and there's some complex as well as straightforward ideas. The second one, not quite as appropriate. It starts with a letter opening, which isn't suitable, and the register is a little bit mixed here. This assessment criteria is possibly the most difficult one for students to understand, so it's worth spending plenty of time in the classroom showing students what it means. Maybe giving students 2 or 3 responses to a task, all of which are at different levels for this criteria, and asking them to think about what the task requires first of all, in terms of the 4 areas we mentioned, genre, format, register and function, and then analysing the responses and thinking about which band each response should sit in. It's a very useful activity to do. Later, as they're more confident with the assessment criteria, of course, they can use this on their own writing. It's really useful to get them to go back to essays they've written earlier on in the course to analyse those to see what would they have awarded themselves. We'll move on to organisation next. Organisation, in contrast to the previous criteria, might seem more straightforward. Basically, we're thinking, is the task well organised? Paragraphing is one area, not just paragraphing, but logical paragraphing. Students sometimes add paragraphs, but haven't really thought about the function of each paragraph. And sometimes weaker candidates, weaker students fall into this, just breaking up their writing randomly. But also the use of cohesive devices. And by this I mean discourse markers and linking words, words like therefore, as a matter of fact, after that, things that link ideas together. Substitution is also important. Using pronouns to substitute for nouns makes a text flow much better and makes it better organised. Also language, which although language is a separate criteria, of course there's features like relative clauses which help to organise a text. All of these features, if they're used well, really distinguish a mark of 5 from the lower mark of 3. It's maybe one of the areas that weaker candidates, weaker students can score marks, but don't do as well because they don't show a really good understanding of how these areas work. So let's have a look at the descriptors here. And again, I've highlighted the relevant words. So for a 5, the text is well organised and coherent, a variety of cohesive devices and organisational patterns to good effect. And I think very often when we have a really well organised text, you hardly notice the use of these cohesive devices. They just slot in very naturally. For a 3, sometimes it isn't quite as natural. very often weaker students will use linking words, maybe slightly incorrectly or just maybe with the wrong register. Always stands out to me the use of the word moreover. I don't think I've ever written moreover in a serious piece of writing. Students seem to like it a lot. Weaker students throw it in, knowing that it's a linking device, but sometimes it just doesn't fit well, doesn't flow well. And for mark of 1, the text is connected and coherent, but maybe there is use of more basic linking words, or it's very limited. It depends on the level, of course. At the lower levels, students might just be using and but. But when you see this at a higher level, it's really going to have an effect on the marking for organisation. So let's think about how we can highlight this in the classroom. This is a nice activity which I like to do even with non-exam classes. It again provides a lot of speaking practice as well as raising awareness of organisation. Write some sentences which could be joined together to answer one of the exam questions. Between 12 and 15 is a good number. Can depend on your class size. I used to do this with a class of 30 and have 2 separate groups. Give each student a piece of paper with one of the sentences on. I liked to try and get them to sit in a circle because then they would listen to each other and there was no start or end. It may not be practical in your classroom setting. But in the groups, they take it in turn to read out their sentence and discuss as a group which order the sentences should go in. And I used to make them change seats so that they were sitting in the order that they decided. When they think they've got the right order, they can then decide how they would organise the paragraphs, if they'd make any changes to make the text flow better, maybe bringing any structures in, any language that they can show off to the examiner to help organise their piece of writing. So let's look at an example. This is just the introduction, so it's the first paragraph from a sample response in the book. And this again referred to the review task that we looked at earlier. So there are 4 sentences here which came from that review. I've mixed them up. So in essence, this is 1 sentence for each candidate, for each student. This is how I reordered them. So you can see from the colours, the 3rd sentence on the left-hand side became the opening. The first one became the second, and so on. And I made the adaptation to join 2 of those ideas together. And the last sentence I reworded as a rhetorical question, just to show I know this language, I'm showing off to the examiner that I can use a rhetorical question. It gives a lot of speaking practice as well as a focus on organisation. I really like this task. It helps students to think about the options for their own writing. So that just leaves us with one more category to look at, and that's language, which many students particularly, but also some teachers, think is the main focus of the mark scheme. As I mentioned earlier, that's not the case. All of the areas are equally important. Both structure, i.e. grammar, and vocabulary come under this area. And it isn't really just enough to think about accuracy, we also think about the fluency. As we know, good language learners will try out new language. They aren't always successful, but they're ambitious. And this is recognised in the Cambridge mark scheme, because if students just stick to language which is at a lower level, which they can use very accurately, they will limit the marks that are available to them. If they're a bit more ambitious and use some language which is maybe at the top of the level or even a higher level, even if it isn't totally correct, they will get credit for that. So this is a really positive thing about the mark scheme, I think, that it really reflects good language learning practice. So the assessment criteria for this, and you can see there's a little bit more to look at now. The first line in each of these focuses on the range of vocabulary, including less common lexis. So this is where that ambition is rewarded. A range including less common lexis for a mark of 5. For a mark of 3, a range of everyday vocabulary, occasional inappropriate use of less common lexis, so we're not over-penalising the candidate who's tried to be ambitious. For a mark of 1, everyday vocabulary, generally appropriate, but they sometimes overuse certain words. The second sentence in each of these 3, the same but thinking about the grammatical form. So for 5, a range of simple and complex grammatical form with control and flexibility. I really like that idea of the control and flexibility, being able to make sure that the phrases and the structures they use fit with the functions and the content. For 3, it's a good degree of control. For 1, simple grammatical forms, so we would expect the basics for the level to be right there, but maybe it's limited in how ambitious they are. And it's only really the third of those sentences in the descriptors that focus on accuracy. And for mark 5, the writing does not have to be perfect. There may be errors, but the important thing is they do not impede communication. They don't stop anybody understanding. Similarly for 3, errors do not impede communication. For 1, errors may be noticeable, but you can still work out the meaning. Now, sometimes it's not quite clear what impeding communication means. If we take an example of spelling, if a student spells a word incorrectly and it doesn't spell another word, then maybe they're not impeding communication. If it spells another word, then that might be confusing. So let's think about how we use this in the classroom. And for this, I've chosen to look at the Part 1 activity for C1, which of course is the compulsory task. Students have to do this. Quite a lot of content given. They actually have quite a lot of reading to do before they get going. I've got several classroom activities to suggest for this. Firstly, relating to lexis or vocabulary. Now, this might be something you already do with your students, but it's a really good thing to encourage them to do. Thinking about different vocabulary. So here, using this example, I'm thinking to establish the theme for the task and the topic. And in the task we've just looked at, it was about volunteering and young people doing things in the community. Write these 3 things as headings on the board. Give students strictly 1 minute to write down as many words that relate to these headings as possible. So, for example, donate might relate to volunteering, youth might relate to young people, society might relate to community. At the end of the minute, make sure they put their pens away so they don't add anything, and then take ideas from the class to build up a comprehensive list on the board. And depending on the class and your rapport with them, I used to give this a competitive element by awarding 1 point for any word that's relevant but which nobody else in the class has. So this really encourages students to think of different words, different things that they can contribute. My next activity is about paraphrasing. This is a key skill in all of the papers, and it's a really good thing to promote. So I've taken here some phrases from that task, and I would ask students to work individually first of all, and then maybe compare with a partner and think, how could they say this in a different way? So these are the examples that I came up with, and you can see they're all longer, and I don't think this matters because this is a prompt for the language that students could understand from the task and then use in their writing. And again, it's showing the examiner that the students have a wider range of language than just somebody who picks up and uses the same words. So that's the 4 assessment criteria. They all come together to give us an overall mark of 20 for the writing. Before the end of the term, just before the students take their exam, I'd like to give them a whole classroom activity so that they've practiced thinking about all 4 assessment criteria separately, but now they bring them all together. So to do this, I used to take a whole lesson, sometimes a whole 3-hour lesson, hand out responses to different tasks along with the tasks. Students work in groups to read the response and overall to discuss the strengths and weaknesses. They refer to the 4 assessment criteria, which of course by this point they should know quite well, and they try to reach agreement on what mark to award for each one and so overall. Finally, get some feedback from the class to ask each group to present their findings. What mark did they reach? And of course then tell them what mark was given and why. And the interesting thing here is that I very often found students were much, much harder than the examiner. They were always quite shocked when they would hear this essay got a mark of 5, and they would be really critical. But it's quite an insight for them. Finally, I think a really valuable thing, and I mention this in each of the books, is to ask students to write their own checklist. You can give them a checklist of things to check in their writing, but there is great value in them producing that themselves. It would include common errors. It could be spellings of certain words. If they often make mistakes with articles or prepositions or punctuation, they should have that on their checklist. But making them produce that themselves is really valuable. Again, they take ownership of their learning. So I do hope this has given you some insight in how the Cambridge mark scheme is applied by examiners, and most importantly, how you can make use of it with your students in the classroom. No matter the age of the candidates, if some of them have lower level English, you might need to translate some of the content, but it's really useful information for them to have. It really helps them to take ownership of their own learning and to start to analyse their own writing and think how they can improve for their exam. So it just remains for me to wish you the best of luck with your teaching, whether it's for exams or not, and the best of luck to your students. Thank you very much and goodbye.
So I'd just like to thank Margaret very much for preparing that tutorial. She was very sorry not to be able to deliver it live. She has, in fact, another engagement in Cambridge today. But she has said that if there are any questions, she's more than happy to respond to these. So I think if you do have questions regarding the writing marking criteria specifically, you may put them through Cooze and they will come to me and therefore to Margaret. But if you have any questions now, I'd be very happy to have a discussion. You can put a question in the chat, or again, you may put your question by email through Cooze and therefore to me. Thank you very much.